Francis Watson. I teach at Durham University in the northeast of England. I taught for some years in London and then went into the frozen north up to Aberdeen, and Durham is about halfway between London and Aberdeen, so I sort of split the difference between the two for what may well be my final position in my career. And so I've been there now for 6-7 years, and most of the book which we're discussing was actually written in Durham, although its roots go back to Aberdeen. And the book is entitled Gospel Writing: A Canonical Perspective. And it sort of goes back to when I first moved to Aberdeen, and I took on a whole lot of courses from my predecessors. And one was obviously the kind of first year introduction to the gospel course. And I thought it would be fun to include some non-canonical material, because I think that theology students, whatever their perspective, should know that that stuff exists, the non-canonical as well as the canonical, and should know what's going on. And so I introduced lectures not only on Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, but also on Thomas and Mary and some of these other texts as well. And to my surprise and pleasure, there was a lot of positive feedback from students from all kinds of different theological positions, who I think grateful to be introduced to this stuff. They sort of knew it was out there but didn't know what it was, didn't know how to handle it. So really I would say that this whole rather large 700-page book in a sense grows out of that first year introduction to Gospels course that I taught in Aberdeen some years ago. That was the genesis of it, even though most of it has been written since I've been in Durham. I'm calling this Gospel Writing, and then the subtitle is A Canonical Perspective. And I think there's two halves of the title. The title and the subtitle actually are intended to fit together quite closely. Gospel writing was a phrase that came to mind fairly early in my work, and I'm trying to communicate by that the idea that there is an ongoing process of getting Jesus' tradition down in writing and then rewriting and constant rewriting, constantly developing a tradition of getting tradition about Jesus down in textual form. And of course that doesn't stop with the completion of the so-called Fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John. We tend to be so fixated on the canonical text that we think that by the time we've got John in place around about the year 100, the production of Gospels ceases. But of course it doesn't. There is all the stuff that later became non-canonical, but no one knows initially that it is non-canonical, because the non-canonical distinction is, as it were, imposed on this material retrospectively. So initially the idea behind the concept of gospel writing is of an ongoing process of production of gospel or gospel-like texts, which goes well beyond the canonical and produces a profusion of different literature, all with Jesus at the centre, but nevertheless with lots of different ideological takes on just what Jesus' significance is. But then there's the canonical perspective thing which kicks in, and this is the moment towards the end of the 2nd century, I would say. Some people would say slightly earlier. I would say towards the end of the 2nd century, when this great divide is retrospectively imposed on the field of gospel writing, and 4 texts remain on one side of the divide, and all other texts, all other gospel-related texts, remain on the other side of the divide. So gospel writing, a canonical perspective, is really trying to communicate that really double-sided view of, on the one hand, a proliferation of Jesus-related writing, but on the other hand, and secondarily, this great and obviously highly significant decision that 4 of these texts are going to count and are going to carry authority in future, and the others are not. If the question is why 4 rather than, say, 3 or 5 or 8, then it's quite hard to come up with an answer. At least it's hard to come up with a rational answer. The imaginative answer that is popular from the late 2nd century onwards is to find scriptural examples of things happening in groups of 4, and to see those as a kind of image of the 4 gospel collections. So the famous example is the 4 living creatures around the throne of God in Revelation chapter 4, a bit of a background also in Ezekiel 1 there. Another also popular, though less well-known scriptural example of a foursome applied to the 4 canonical gospels is the 4 rivers that flow out of paradise. So you can give imaginative answers like that, but ultimately there isn't really an answer, because it just is a kind of brute fact that this was the decision that was taken collectively, that there would be 4 and not 5 or 8 or however many. So there's no real answer to the question of why 4. But in relation to the question why not harmonise them, that question, of course, did come up in the early church, and the famous example of that is the figure of Tatian, the student of Justin Martyr in Rome, who seems to have headed back towards his roots in sort of Syriac-speaking context right in the east, and to have produced what's usually described as a harmony of the 4 Gospels, and is, or was, an attempt to combine at least 4 existing Gospels. He may well draw on material from other Gospels as well, but his main goal is to produce a single, if you like, mega Gospel that would include all that anyone needs to know. And this text actually functioned as the definitive canonical form of the Gospel in a Syriac-speaking context till about the early 5th century, when the link with Tatian becomes problematic, because Tatian is actually kind of heretic. He's not the worst kind of heretic, but they've decided they don't like him. So only at that stage does the Syriac-speaking church go for 4 Gospels as opposed to a single inclusive Gospel. So then the question is, well, why didn't everyone else follow suit? And I think the best one can do is to say that the significance of the plurality of the Gospels is that it preserves the idea of multiple perspectives on the figure of Jesus. It is saying, in effect, that there is no single correct perspective, no single absolute definitive and authoritative account of who Jesus is. We need more than one account, and each account will capture a particular angle, a particular perspective on Jesus, but no one of those is definitive, and no one of those can be separated from the others. So I think rather than asking the questions of why they did this, I think it may be more fruitful to think about what its effect is and what its significance is. And it seems to me that the main significance is to introduce into Christian thought and practice the idea that the reality of Jesus is so rich and complex that it can't be captured in any one text, but needs to be looked at from the diverse angles represented by the 4 evangelists. Yeah, well, Augustine is worried by discrepancies, and he is worried by big discrepancies. He's also worried by little discrepancies. So if Mark has Jesus restoring the sight or bestowing sight on blind Bartimaeus on the way out of Jericho, and Luke has him doing so on the way into Jericho, Augustine is worried even by a discrepancy of that kind, and he'll speculate at least about whether Jesus might have healed one blind man on the way into Jericho and another quite separate blind man on the way out. So in other words, you can harmonise the two by multiplying the number of people whom Jesus bestows sight on. So he's worried by those kind of discrepancies. I think we have to go back a stage, though, and not focus initially on discrepancies, also called contradictions, but just think about differences, because of course it is differences that makes one gospel the Gospel of Mark and another gospel the Gospel of Luke. If there weren't differences, if it was all identical, then we wouldn't have 4 Gospels, we would have one Gospel in 4 copies. So it's the differences that make the Gospels the distinct entities that they are. And if we're committed to the canonical form of the Gospel, this fourfold plural form, I think we have to see differences as a positive rather than a negative factor. That would include even points where there might appear to be contradictions, we should look for positive theological significance in those points, positive reasons why an evangelist tells a story one way and another evangelist tells a story another way, rather than worrying too much about how the two stories could be reconciled at the level of empirical reality. And that's not just my idea, because I get that from a figure who's even earlier than Augustine, and that's the great Alexandrian theologian Origen, who is the hero of the penultimate chapter of my book, who says exactly that, who says if we just had one gospel, we would assume that that gospel was a straightforward transcript of what Jesus did and said, or at least the most important things that Jesus did or said. There wouldn't be any problem at all about assuming that it corresponded to exactly what happened. But since we've got plural gospels, we can't assume that any one of them gives an absolutely accurate and authoritative account of who Jesus is. And what we have to do is not to try to harmonise them at the level of empirical reality, which means, for example, multiplying occasions on which Jesus heals bestows sight on the blind man, or multiplying the number of occasions when herds of pigs jump over cliffs, etc. But rather seeing that the different ways in which each evangelist tells a story each have their own rationale, their own theological significance, and we should therefore look for the theological significance in the different ways the stories are told, rather than worrying too much about what actually happened, which is the worry that Augustine has.
So would you say that it's on the level of this theological significance that they're bound together as canon?
I think that's right, yes, and it means that for any one telling of a story about Jesus, or a saying of Jesus, if there are parallels in other Gospels, it means that that particular telling of a story or recounting of a saying of Jesus can be enriched by the different take on the same material that other evangelists will have. And I think we should see that as enriching, not as a problem, because if we see it as a problem, then we're saying that we actually wish we didn't have 4 Gospels. We would rather have something else. And that seems to me to be an odd position to take. I think that was sort of Augustine's position, at least when he wrote that particular book dealing with this issue. I think he was almost at the point of saying it would be so much simpler if we just had one Gospel rather than 4. And that seems to me to be problematic. We have 4, and we need to see that as a plus rather than a minus. These have often been used in the past as points which appear to discredit Christian faith. So Augustine is worried about these points because if a contradiction is proved, he thinks it'll discredit Christian faith. And then much later, at the time of the Enlightenment, you get radical deistic critics like Reimarus. They too think that if they can find contradictions between gospel narratives, that this discredits Christian faith. So part of my agenda, as it were, is to address this very long-standing problem that differences between the Gospels are seen as potential points, potential weaknesses for Christian faith, and it seems to me that that's an entirely unnecessary supposition. But the other part of the answer to your question, I suppose, has to do with the state of current Gospel scholarship. And I suppose my main concern there is to extend the range of what we do as Gospel scholars. I think typically we teach our students that what really matters is to understand how Matthew, Mark, Luke and John came into being, the first 3 obviously in a very close relationship to one another, John at a little bit of distance from those other 3, but then once John is safely in place, and once we've sort of carefully taught students how to read these texts, we pass on to something else. So in other words, we study the Gospels within an entirely first century context, and we don't move on from there and ask how it is that we get to this 4 Gospel collection, which I argue creates actually a new textual object in which each Gospel ceases to be just itself, but exists within this fourfold collection, so that even when one Gospel is in the foreground of the picture, one can only be reading one Gospel at a time, the other 3 are going to be there in the background, inevitably. So it seems to me that the problem with the tradition of gospel scholarship as it's developed over the last couple of hundred years is that it is not sufficiently interested in what happens in the 2nd century, an ongoing production of gospel literature, but then this, I think, very interesting and important, fruitful decision that is collectively taken across the Christian world. It happens gradually, and of course there are ambiguities, but it's still a clear decision that there are 4 gospels on one side of the divide, and everything else falls on the other side of the divide. And I think our accounts of the Gospels and Gospel origins should include all of that, and should show not just how individual Gospels come into being, but should show how the 4 Gospel collection comes into being, because of course it's that collection which has dominated Christian life ever since. It's not just individual Gospels in isolation from one another, it's the collection, and it's that object of the Fourfold Gospel that I think should be the ultimate object of our study when we're doing gospel scholarship.
Does your study of the reception of the Gospels throughout the centuries owe anything to Brevard Childs and his way of doing it?
I think it probably does. It's a little bit difficult to say, because Childs in some ways was not terribly interested in the historical processes by which things happen, by which the canonical books came to be canonical. So he will dutifully repeat the various theories about that, but that's not really where his interest lies. He's more interested, I think, certainly in his New Testament as Canon book, in asking about what happens to the individual text when it becomes canonical, but he's less interested in the historical process by which it becomes canonical. He's also, I think, almost entirely uninterested in the material that canons exclude, and that, I think, is the distinctive element, or one distinctive element in my proposal. I think that a canon is significant not just for what it includes, but also what it excludes, and looking at what it excludes can, I think, shed light back on what it includes, so we can learn a lot about a canonical gospel by comparing and contrasting the way that material is presented in a canonical gospel with the way that similar material turns up in, say, the Gospel of Thomas. And that's something that Childs didn't do. I mean, Childs achieved a lot, and he worked in both testaments, and he's been a very, very influential and important figure for myself and for others. But I think there are ways of doing this kind of canonical work that go quite a long way beyond what he was able to achieve, which is of course not to detract from it at all, because there's only so much that any one scholar can do, and he carried out his work in the teeth of some very, very sharp and harsh criticism from other leading figures in the biblical studies guilds. Childs is certainly very interested in the Four Gospel collection, and the idea that a text, in a sense, changes its meaning or significance when it becomes canonical, when it's recognized as playing certain kinds of normative roles within a community. That is certainly a point where I would be in full agreement with Childs. So you're right, there is quite a lot of Childs in there. I have written quite a bit about Childs, mainly appreciatively in the past. I read everything of his I could get my hands on. That was actually some time ago now, so it's not quite as sort of fresh in my consciousness as it once was, but I do acknowledge that almost anyone, including myself, doing anything that describes itself as a canonical perspective is going to be indebted in one way or another to Childs. Recently
you wrote an article for Eerdmans, our
blog.
Did. And you described the Fourfold Gospel testimony as not only true, but beautiful. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, I think I was writing in that context specifically about a wonderful old Four Gospel book, which was actually produced in the northeast of England where I live, called the Lindisfarne Gospels. We've just had a big exhibition in Durham centred on this wonderful book, to which huge numbers of people have come, because this book is almost a kind of icon of the northeast of England. There's a lot of local resentment that it's housed down in London in the British Library. A lot of the locals would love to get it back, and the wilder types talked of kidnapping it and not allowing it to return. That's all by the by, though. This is a gospel book with obviously the Latin text of the four Gospels, but a spectacular decorative element. The opening words, and especially the opening few letters of each Gospel, are given extraordinarily elaborate decorative treatment. There are wonderful portraits of evangelists, complete with the traditional evangelist symbols, Mark and his lion, and Luke with his calf, and John with his eagle, Matthew with his human figure. And clearly the producers of this book are trying to present the text of the Gospels in as beautiful a way as possible. The artwork isn't just there in order to show off artistic skills, it's there to enhance the impact of the Gospel text itself. And so the producers of this book and the other books from the same period that one might compare it with are in effect saying that this material is not only true and important for our lives and our understanding of the world, it also has a beauty of its own, and it's therefore appropriate that the very highest level of artistic skill should be involved in the production of a gospel book. That was probably the context in which I spoke about the beauty of the Fourfold Gospel, very much influenced by close study which I've been engaging in of this particular wonderful old early 8th century gospel book. I think those guys were right to think that high-class artwork is appropriate to the text of the four Gospels that these books contain. So it's not exactly a direct answer to your question, but that's where the idea of the beauty of the Fourfold collection came from. On the one hand, you clearly have some kind of audience in mind, and you have a kind of ideal reader who is interested in the same things that you are interested in, who you hope to persuade to adopt your own point of view. On the other hand, you know that when you send a piece of writing out into the world, when you hand it over to a publisher like yourselves, it goes out into the world, it's very nice, but it's almost entirely beyond my control. So you just have to accept the fact that although you would love people to, well, first of all, you'd love them to read it from beginning to end, and you'd love them to agree with your conclusions, you can't compel people to do that, of course. And some people will dip into it, some people will try to find support for positions that they already hold, which might or might not coincide with views that I would myself be comfortable with. It'll be used in all kinds of different ways. But I would still hope that this particular version of a canonical perspective on the Gospels will have some influence, because I think it's so important that as biblical scholars we take reception much more seriously and realise that simply focusing on the production and the origins of texts and what authors are doing with texts in their original situation is just not good enough, because we only have these texts because their early users decided that they were worth keeping, they were worth continuing to engage with, and of course people have been engaging with them ever since. One spin-off of that is that it means that it's suddenly much easier for myself as a biblical scholar with an interest in reception to find all kinds of things to talk about to people in other humanities disciplines who work with biblical material from a later date perhaps, and who are often quite keen to hear a biblical scholar's point of view on the material that they work on. So going back to the Lindisfarne Gospels that I was mentioning a moment ago, this and similar gospel books are obviously of particular interest to art historians, and art historians, of course, have got tremendous expertise in identifying where the various sort of motifs, the artistic motifs, come from, and so on. But they're not so good at asking the question of what these texts are doing, what these artworks are doing specifically within a gospel book, and how the art might relate to the text. And that's where I, as a biblical scholar, might have something to contribute, but I only do because I take a serious interest in the reception of texts, and this gives me common ground with a whole lot of other people who are also working with biblical or Bible-related material, but who perhaps may benefit from the input of a biblical scholar, as I benefit from from what I learn from them as art historians or whatever. So I would be delighted, I am delighted to see already signs in the discipline that people are taking reception much more seriously, and I hope that my book will encourage and further that process and produce a situation in which it's just taken for granted that an Introduction to Gospels course for undergraduates gets us well beyond the year 100, at least to the year 200 and the formation of the Four Gospel collection, and preferably quite a lot later as well.